Welcome to the CMDE Learning Online. There has always been questions raised from the applicants, especially the foreign applicants, like how to use the data from overseas clinical investigation of medical device in the Chinese marketing authorization. During this online learning course, I will give you an insight into the basic principles and main consideration of the regulatory authority, and provide you with some technical requirements and review experience from the perspective of a reviewer. There are 3 sections in this course series, and the topic of today's section will focus on the scope of the application and basic principles. The other 2 sections will be present in the follow-up sessions. This course series is applicable for the applicants whose marketing authorization contains overseas clinical investigation, and the technical reviewer from the regulatory authority. My introduction will mainly refer to the technical guidelines for the acceptance of overseas clinical investigation data of medical device, which was released in January of 2018. The Chinese version of the technical guidelines is published in the official website of CMDE, which is attached on the slides. If you are interested, you could look for more details there. To begin with, what is the purpose of this policy? As shown in these slides, there are 2 purposes. One is to avoid or reduce repetitive clinical investigations. The other is to accelerate the marketing of medical device in China. Next, let's make clear the scope of application. In the previous online learning course, my colleague has introduced that there are 3 clinical evaluation pathways during the marketing authorization. Their exemption pathway, comparison with the comparable device pathway, and clinical investigation pathway. Except the exemption pathway, clinical investigation may be required as a pre-market clinical evidence in the last 2 pathways. Those overseas clinical investigations may have been conducted abroad, or could be a multi-region clinical investigation that contains sites in China. They are scientifically designed and undertaken to assess the safety, clinical performance, and/or effectiveness of the medical device under normal use conditions. Each site shall meet the GCP requirement in compliance with the local laws and regulations. Now, how to take a full advantage of the data from overseas clinical investigation during the clinical evaluation. When applicants select the clinical investigation pathway, the data can be used as clinical investigation material. There has been plenty successful cases following this pathway since the clinical evaluation and the biostatistics division was established, such as the cardiovascular devices. And when choosing the comparison with a comparable device pathway, applicants shall conduct a clinical evaluation. Well, characteristics should be broadly similar between the device in question with the comparable device, but consideration must be given to the impact of the device's differences. Overseas clinical investigation can be used as one possible clinical evidence which demonstrates that the differences among these devices will not bring adverse effect on the product safety, clinical performance, and/or effectiveness. The clinical evidence can be an existing overseas clinical investigation that is able to validate the differences, or a soundly designed overseas clinical investigation based on the differences. Here is a simple example. When applicants plans to extend the use of implantable cardiac pacemaker in the MRI environment, overseas clinical investigation can be submitted to confirm the safety and effectiveness of the device used in the MRI under labeled use. Of course, based on the technical innovation compared with the older generations, other clinical data may also be required, such as the published literature, reports of the clinical experience, post-market reports, and adverse event data. What are basic principles? There are 3 basic principles for accepting data from overseas clinical investigation: ethical principle, legal principle, and scientific principle. The first one, ethical principle. As a general principle, the rights, safety, and well-being of clinical investigation subjects shall be protected consistent with the ethical principles laid down in the Declaration of Helsinki, as well as the applicable regulatory requirements or other relevant standards. And second, legal principle. Overseas clinical investigations shall be conducted in countries or regions where clinical investigation quality management is properly executed and compliance to the good clinical practice of medical device in China. If there are differences in the GCP of medical device among China and countries or regions where clinical investigation is undertaken, the applicant shall describe the differences in detail and fully demonstrate that such differences will not affect the authenticity, scientificity, reliability, and traceability of the investigation results, and managed in the interest of subject safety. In addition, the applicants and the clinical investigation sites or institutions shall accept the supervision and on-site inspection of the National Medical Product Administration. The last one, scientific principle. The applicants shall ensure the accuracy and completeness of the data reported without screening. The data from overseas clinical investigation shall be authentic, scientific, reliable, and traceable, and shall ensure the clear statement of the objectives, a scientifically sound design with appropriate rationale and statistical analysis method, an interpretation of the results and appropriate conclusions, interest of subject safety. Other personnel are protected from the potential risks. This is all of this section. We now move to the Q&A.